All right, well, since nobody could come and be here in person tonight, this is going to allow us to go back and cover the material that I wasn't able to cover last week. So we're going to look at a few objections to apologetics. Now, sometimes these objections will come from non-Christians, but even sometimes there are Christians. We talked about presuppositionalists who would oppose more traditional forms of apologetics. But there are some other objections that some Christians will have to apologetics. So my hope is to address some of those tonight. So the first objection is that basically it is intolerant, right? Intolerance is a big thing in our culture right now. And just the idea of making a case that your belief system, your religion is objectively true, which implies that others are false, is intolerant. Now, the first thing that I would say is that's just a misunderstanding of what tolerance is. For some reason, we've come to think in our culture that tolerance means that you have to affirm everybody's beliefs or agree with everybody's beliefs. And that's just, well, silly, first of all. And there would be no room for tolerance if everybody agreed, because tolerance itself assumes there's a disagreement. And when you are tolerant of somebody you disagree with, you tolerate them, or you're respectful to them. You don't try to silence them or shun them or be mean to them. No, you're tolerant of their opposing view. You don't try to squash it or you try to silence them, but you disagree with it respectfully, calmly, rationally. That's how you disagree in a tolerant way. So I will admit that apologists from time to time have been intolerant. They have been, and I'm guilty of this as well, overly aggressive and not gentle and respectful and kind when they argued with others or tried to defend what they believed. But apologetics, or defending your Christian beliefs, doesn't necessarily have to be done that way. In fact, I'm a proponent, even though I fail at it sometimes, I'm a proponent of making a case for Christianity in a loving, respectful way. And what that means is, first of all, no name calling. You call people what they would prefer to be called. In other words, you don't call them by a derogatory name or a name that they would not prefer. You call them by the name that they would use of themselves. I think that's the respectful thing to do. It also means not using sarcasm. Sorry. I know some people think they have the gift of sarcasm, but sarcasm does not help in conversations. And you know this when you've been on the opposite side. Sarcasm just is mean. And then we don't want to build straw men. We don't want to make enemies out of thin air and think that we defeat them, but deal with actual real opponents. It's so easy, and this happens in politics and apologetics, both, where we take maybe the worst arguments for those that we disagree with and destroy them, and then puff ourselves up thinking that we've done such a great job, where in fact what we need to do is take our opponent's best arguments and work at understanding them and then defeating them, if in fact we think they're wrong. So that can be done in a very tolerant way, being friendly. I have a lot of friends that disagree with Christianity, that are atheists or of other religions, and we tolerate each other. We have good discussions where we disagree, but we're not intolerant. Basically, what I'm trying to say here is that there's a right way to disagree and there's a wrong way to disagree. We can be very confident and bold for our respective positions without being a jerk. It can be difficult sometimes, but it can be done. So what I strive for, and what I think Christian apologists should strive for, is to disagree respectfully and in love. Now, this objection, sometimes that apologetics is intolerant, sometimes this objection comes from the idea that religious faith is more of a subjective preference, not an objective truth. So, for instance, if religion or your belief system was just more of a, not a belief in objective truth, but more of just a preference or something you like, then people find it to be intolerant if you say of what somebody else likes, that it's wrong. It would be like saying, oh, you like vanilla? Well, that's not right. You shouldn't like vanilla. Well, who are you to say what who are you to say what I should like or not like? But that's not, I hope it'll be clear after this at least, that that's not what we're claiming about Christianity. We're not claiming that it's a subjective preference, that religious beliefs are not subjective preferences, but they're actually objective truth claims. At least I want to make it clear that that's what I'm claiming about Christianity, that it is objectively true. This isn't just a subjective preference. I'm claiming that it is objectively true, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So, again, those who think that of religious faith more as a subjective preference, they don't see, or they would oppose apologetics, they would oppose what I'm trying to do, base my religious beliefs on reasons and evidence. They would oppose that because they think of it more as a subjective preference. I'll give you an example of that. Because this is a very common view of religious truth, that it's just a subjective preference. It's just what inspires you or motivates you. So back when I worked in the business world, and when I was an actuary for various insurance companies, I would read the Wall Street Journal every day, like most business people do. And I was really excited at one point because there was a weekend special that was going to have a debate within the newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, between how it was advertised, between a Christian and an atheist, man versus God type of debate in the weekend edition of the Wall Street Journal. So I was very excited to read that. You can see I took a picture of it even. This was the heading of it. And so I was excited to see, how both sides were going to make their case. However, as I began to read it, I became very quickly disappointed because the person arguing for Christianity wrote things like this. She wrote, "Religion should not be regarded as factual, but therapeutic. It's about how to cope with mortality, discover an inner source of strength, and endure pain and suffering." So you see what she's saying here. At least for her, Christianity she wasn't making objective claims about reality. No, for her, religion, Christianity in this case, was just a subjective preference that helped when life got tough. It motivates, inspires, and that's how she was promoting religious belief. And that's not what I'm saying. I'm claiming that God actually exists out there. I'm making objective truth claims. It could be right or wrong, but I want to make it clear that I'm not, like she was, just talking about subjective preferences. I'm making claims of what's actually true out there. This perspective, and again, this is very common in our culture, and unfortunately even within the church it's fairly common, but it's this idea that religious faith is true for you if it works for you. So if Christianity is therapeutic for you, it helps you with life, makes you feel better when you're lonely, helps you deal with difficult situations, then it works for you. It's true for you. If Buddhism does those things, then Buddhism is true for you. And it creates this relative truth or this subjective truth that something can be true for you and not for me. And we see this all over our culture when it comes to religious truth. For example, Oprah is a very well-known proponent of this position. She talks about how nobody knows your truth better than you. Take time to consult your inner guide and trust it. And so this idea that religious truth is somehow just an internal subjective preference that you choose because it helps you. It's true for you. And so they're thinking of religion as more of a preference. It's true for you if that's what you prefer. And so they do think of it more like the flavor of ice cream. It's a subjective preference. There's not one absolute true flavor. It's relative per person. And so what comes from this perspective is sayings like, something can be true for you but not for me. You hear people who have this position say things like, well, don't push your truth on me. So they've redefined the word truth. They're using the term truth in a completely different way than I am, that it has been used in the past. Now, terms change, I understand that, and language is very fluid, but we just have to be clear and very careful how we communicate these things so that when we say Christianity is true as Christians, people don't mistake us and hear us saying something like this. We need to be clear that we're actually making objective truth claims that can be right or wrong objectively, not just talking about our subjective preferences. Sometimes we just have to clarify that. Even Francis Schaeffer, 50 years ago, struggled with this as he tried to communicate Christianity to the European culture and then the American culture. So he had to start saying true truth. I'm claiming that Christianity is true truth. It really is true, objectively, not just my subjective preference that makes me feel better. In fact, I would say relative truth in and of itself is a contradiction. It's impossible for truth to be relative. If you understand truth to be that which corresponds to reality, truth is what is. Truth is what a true statement reflects what is actually happening or going on in reality. And so if that's what truth is, then it's impossible for truth to be relative. And that's not how people think of truth in other areas of life. Just think with me for a moment here, right? That's not how people think of truth in virtually all other areas of life, except, unfortunately, religious truth. For example, right, if you're taking a test, let's say you're taking a test in one of your science classes in high school or college, and you put down on the test, let's say that a horse is a reptile, or something outlandish like that, right? Your professor is going to mark that wrong. You'll probably get an F on your test if you say things like that, right? Now, you wouldn't be able to go to your professor and say, well, don't push your truth on me. Who are you to tell me that I can't believe these? Well, no, because we understand, in science at least, that truth is what corresponds to reality. Also, another silly example, if you went to your bank teller, let's say, and you said, I'd like to withdraw $1 million. Now, your bank teller, if you're anything like me, is going to inform you very quickly that you don't have $1 million in your checking account to withdraw. Now, what are you supposed to say? Can you say to your bank teller then, well, that might be true for you, but it's not true for me. It's true for me that I do have $1 million in there. No, truth just doesn't work that way. Truth is absolute. Truth is what corresponds to reality. Truth is objective, and it's not relative per person. That's the way that I'm using truth when I'm trying to make a case for Christianity. No, if something is true, it's true for everybody. Take gravity, for instance, right? Gravity is one of those truths that affects everybody because it's an absolute truth. That's how things are. It corresponds to reality. And I would say then that understanding of truth would imply that all truth is absolute. There is no relative truth. If something is true, then it's true for all persons at all times, in all places. Truth simply is just telling it how it is. I'm operating under the correspondence theory of truth, if you want to get technical about it. I'll just make that very simple here. Let's say I tell one of my sons, I've got 3 sons here that live with me and my wife here, and let's say I tell one of them to go out and mow the lawn. I'm upstairs working in my office. 5 minutes later, they come back in and they say, "Dad, I can't mow because it's raining outside." And I ask them this question. I say, "Is that true?" And what am I meaning when I ask that question? I'm asking if what they've said, the statement they've said, corresponds to reality. If it's factually true. Is it really raining outside? Is that true? That's the correspondence theory of truth. Truth just is that which corresponds to reality. That's the correspondence theory of truth. And I think really it's impossible to deny it. In fact, I want to show you a quick video and this is of a philosopher at Berkeley University in California. John Searle is his name. He's a philosopher that I respect very much. And I'll let him defend the correspondence theory of truth. The video might not come through very well through the recording here, so we'll put a link down below where you can watch it directly. But take a look at John Searle defending the correspondence theory of truth.
In philosophy, there are certain default opinions. There are certain opinions that everybody has to start from and everybody in the end goes back to. Realism about the real world, for example, or means ends reasoning about rationality. And the default positions are almost always true. There are a few exceptions where we found out scientifically that they were mistaken. I mean, relativity theory showed something about the default position in space and time. But the default position about truth, the one that we all have before we ever start doing philosophy, is the idea that if a statement's true, I say snow's white, or the cat's on the mat, or the sun is 93 million miles away from the Earth, those statements are true because there's something in the world that makes them true. There's something in virtue of which they are true. There's something in the world they correspond to, and we evolved a word for that in English, fact. So the statement that the cat's on the mat, or the statement that snow is white, is true if and only if it corresponds to a certain fact. The fact that the cat's on the mat, or the fact that snow is white. Now, that's gotta be right. Everything I told you has to be right. I mean, it's just ordinary common sense. But in philosophy, it's very easy to get nervous about that and think, oh my gosh, well, these facts must be very funny kind of objects, and there must be a funny kind of relation, this relation of correspondence. No, it's just we need a word to describe the feature of the world, or what it is independently of the statement, in virtue of which the statement is true. We've evolved with that fact. It's quite a recent evolution, by the way. Aristotle didn't have a word like fact. That's why he believed in the correspondence theory, but he couldn't state it using the word fact. He just said, well, to say of something that it is, that's to state the truth. And to say of something that isn't, that's to state the truth. But that's just a fancy way of saying statements are true when they correspond to how things really are, and when they correspond to the facts. So we got this word fact that's designed to match true statement. And then you need a word for the relation. And there are a bunch of words you can say, well, a statement matches the facts, or the statement corresponds to the facts, or the statement describes the facts, or even the statement just states the facts. And that's the correspondence theory. Now, that's got to be right. I don't have any doubts about that. But there are all kinds of fancy arguments to try to show that that isn't right, that we need some coherence theory of truth or what have you. But that's the correspondence theory. A statement is true if it's made true in virtue of something independently of the statement to which it corresponds, which it describes, and those, as I said, we've evolved the word for that. The word is fact.
Well, one of the reasons I like that video so much is that he explains that, you know, language just works such that we need a word to describe something that we're referring to. So if there's a cat, right, or if there's a feline animal, right, in the room, we've evolved a word for that, cat, to describe what we're trying to communicate. And so when we're trying to communicate the concept that something matches up with reality, well, we've evolved the word truth and then later fact to get to that idea. A fact is something that corresponds to reality. Truth is what corresponds to reality. Now, as I said before, I understand that language is fluid, right, and the meanings of our words change, but I think it can be very confusing in our communication when we take a word like fact or truth and then just start using it to mean something completely different. And unfortunately, that has happened with religious truth. It's come to mean not factual truth, but just how you feel on the inside. And there's a little bit of history to that I want to go over tonight to help you understand where that came from and how I think we should resist that idea of religious truth. Okay, I want you to know that relative truth is not a new idea. Even though it's something that our culture is struggling with a lot right now, it's not a new idea. In fact, Plato and Aristotle had to fight against the idea of relative truth. This is a quote from an ancient sophist in Greece named Protagoras. Okay, so we're going to start with this quote from the sophist and see how Plato dealt with it. So Protagoras was one of those proponents of relative truth. He wrote, "The way things appear to me, and that way they exist for me. And the way things appear to you, and that way they exist for you." So in other words, 3,000 years ago plus, he was proposing, or no, I had my timeline wrong. A long time ago, thousands of years ago, he was proposing relative truth. Something can be true for you, but not true for me. Let's see how Plato responds to this. Plato's basic argument against this idea of relative truth is called turning the tables. And this is what Plato said. "If the way things appear to me, in that way they exist for me, then it appears to me that Protagoras' whole doctrine or argument is wrong. And since anything that appears to me is true, then it must be true that Protagoras is wrong." You see how silly this is? And Plato's just pointing it out that relative truth just doesn't work. In fact, it collapses in on itself. And we'll talk about that more specifically here in a moment. Aristotle also focused on this area, as John Searle even quoted this long quote, part of it at least, but Aristotle tried to clarify, "To say of what is that it is not, or of what is not that it is false. While to say of what is that it is, and of what is not that it is not, that is what is true." In other words, they're proposing the correspondence theory of truth. Speaking of a cat loose in the room, we just had our dog got loose for a moment. So Plato, Aristotle, they had to deal with proponents of relative truth in their day. I think objective truth, absolute truth, is undeniable. As John Searle said, even those who try to deny it end up having to use it. Think about it for a moment. You can't even deny objective truth without affirming it. If you say that there is no such thing as objective truth, you're saying it's objectively true, There is no objective truth. So you can't even deny it without using it. In fact, this is a really good idea to test a lot of some of these silly sayings or things that might seem good on the surface. You can test them by applying them back to themselves. Sometimes this is called the boomerang effect or the boomerang test. So whatever statement that somebody makes, apply that statement back to itself and see if it refutes itself. Sometimes this is called being self-referentially incoherent. And denying correspondence theory of truth is self-referentially incoherent, as I've explained. It boomerangs back around and defeats itself, this idea that there is no objective truth, or that truth is not objective. So when somebody makes a claim, if you apply that claim back to itself, if it refutes itself, then you know it's not correct. And you can use that technique in evaluating many different claims. Tonight we're focusing on objective truth. Is there objective truth? It seems that there has to be. Now, thankfully, objective truth is making a comeback in our culture. And this has somewhat to do with the frustration over the recent presidential elections and the Brexit controversy in the UK. In fact, you might have heard that in, 2016, post-truth, the term post-truth was chosen as Oxford Dictionary's word of the year. Now, this was 4 or 5 years ago in the 2016 presidential election, but it's continued, this frustration has continued since then, right? And I want to read you a little bit from this article I found. People frustrated with politicians who claim to be giving facts, claim to be giving objective truth, but are actually more giving just emotional rhetoric. And so a lot of people being frustrated with that were saying, well, we're now in this post-truth era. And people were clamoring for real truth. They were frustrated and they just wanted the facts. They wanted objective truth. And so what I'm saying is objective truth is making a comeback, and I think that's a good thing. Let me read a little bit of this article for you. So in 2016, post-truth was chosen as Oxford Dictionary's word of the year because it was so often used to describe our presidential election that year. A culture is post-truth when objective truth is less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion. Debates turned into endless personal rants, which were disconnected from the actual facts. Many were disgusted by the presidential candidates and accused them of ignoring factual data while trying to appeal simply to people's subjective feelings. But if truth is relative, why is this a problem? Many who were upset over this had been promoting the concept of subjective truth for decades. But when someone they disagreed with started using such a strategy, they realized the concept of subjective relative truth was bankrupt and began proclaiming the reality and importance of objective truth. Now, this was driven home to me powerfully. I presented a philosophy paper in Boston a few years ago, and this was an SBL conference, Society of Biblical Literature, and APA, American Philosophical Association conference. And so there were Christians, non-Christians, all sorts of people presenting papers at this conference. It was in Boston, so there was a lot of people there, both professors and students from Ivy League schools. And it seemed like every paper that I would go and listen to, it was somebody who was frustrated with the presidential election. Usually they were frustrated with the Republican side, and they were clamoring for objective truth, the importance of objective truth. And I could, you could feel the cognitive dissonance in the room, because even one of them, this one young lady, I remember her saying, I'm so bewildered here because for years I've been, thinking and promoting of truth as subjective, but I'm so frustrated, and I know the importance now of objective truth, and At the time they were frustrated with Donald Trump and just so mad that he wasn't giving objective truth according to them. So you could see the cognitive dissonance where they wanted to promote the idea of subjective relative truth, but at the same time they wanted objective truth from Donald Trump and were upset at him because they didn't think he was giving them objective truth. And paper after paper was this exact same thing. A lot of these liberals from Yale at this particular conference. So I'm glad in that sense that objective truth is making a comeback, or people understanding and wanting objective truth. Now, somebody might say, okay, yeah, there's objective truth in science, there's absolute truth for my bank, how much money is in my account, but religious truth is a different type of truth. Religious truth is just different than other types of truth. But why think that? What if somebody is going to make that claim? I would have to, as a skeptic of that claim, be given good reasons and evidence to believe that is the case. Why is religious truth somehow different? Because most religious people, or most people who believe that a religion is true, don't think that way. Most people who believe in a particular religion think that their religious beliefs are objectively true. And as a religious person myself, someone who believes in Christianity, that is my claim, that it is my belief about reality is objectively true. Not just for me, but it's true for everyone. Now, I could be wrong, and that's the thing with objective truth claims. We could be wrong about them, but at least we can be clear that that's what we're proposing. We're proposing the XYZ corresponds to reality, in this case, Christianity. So I think that's the correct way, as opposed to the author of that in the Wall Street Journal. I think that's the correct way to look at religious beliefs, to ask, do they correspond to reality or do they not? Contrary beliefs are possible, but contrary or contradictory truths are not possible. You can believe that everything is true, but everything can't be true in the sense of corresponding to reality. So, for example, when you've got two professors at Oxford, John Lennox, mathematician, professor at Oxford, and Richard Dawkins, a biology professor at Oxford, when they make contradictory claims, one saying God exists, the other one saying that God doesn't exist, and these two have had, historic debates there at Oxford over this issue, which you can find on YouTube and watch. They're great debates. One thing we know for sure is that they can't both be right, because that would be contradictory, and truth can't be contradictory. One of them has to be correct. One of them has to correspond to reality. Now, I understand that a lot of people use the term religious truth in this way. In fact, I've got an example of this. I was talking to a young man at the University of Nebraska once when I was on campus, talking about my faith, talking to people, encouraging them to trust in Jesus Christ, encouraging them to believe that Christianity was true. One young man I had a great conversation with, he told me that he believed in Norse religion. So ancient Northern European kind of Viking religion, Odin, Thor, that was his religion. And I asked him, I wanted to make sure that he was understanding what I was claiming, because I had a feeling what he was saying when he told me that he believed in this Norse religion or Norse mythology. I said, now, do you believe that there actually is a Thor out there somewhere in reality that actually exists? And he said, oh, no. I don't think those stories are objectively true, but I believe and follow them because I think they're good stories that inspire us and motivate us and give us good examples and so on and so forth. And I said, I understand what you're saying, but I want you to understand that that's not what I'm saying about Christianity. Because he thought I believed in Christianity the way that he believed in Norse religion. And I said, just so you know, that's not my claim. I'm claiming there is an actual God out there that exists in reality, objectively. Now, I could be wrong about that, but I want you to understand at least my claim. And then the light bulb went off and he understood what I was getting at now. And then we went on to have a great conversation about why I believed that there is a God out there and why Christianity is true. But first I had to make sure he understood that I was making claims about my religion that were different than his claims about his religion. And I think we just have to work at that, because if we don't, our communication can break down, because this relative truth, the subjective preference idea of religious truth has become so popular in our culture. So when people hear us say Christianity is true, oftentimes they interpret it different than what we mean by that statement. Now, I want to make it clear, I'm not saying it's always easy to know what's true. As finite creatures, it can be very difficult to know what corresponds to reality. But we pursue that, and we make our decisions, and we base our beliefs on the reasons and evidence that we've encountered. It's difficult to know it's true sometimes. It's not always easy. We can admit that, but that's different than saying that there is no truth. Okay, the last thing I want to do, the last objection I want to take a look at is the objection that faith and reason are just enemies. And sometimes, this objection will be seen in the church as well. That faith and reason are opposites, they're enemies. I mean, why? If you could prove that Christianity was true with reasons and evidence, there'd be no need for faith, right? So this is a very common view in our culture, even within the church, that faith and reason are enemies, opposites. And so apologists, trying to make a case for Christianity with reason and evidence, sometimes people object to that because they have this incorrect view of faith and reason. People think it has to be one or the other. Either it's a faith, or it's a belief based on faith, or it's a belief based on reason. It's got to be one or the other, and those things are opposite. Now, to understand why so many people think this way, we have to look at our cultural history. We have to look back and see kind of where this came from, this idea that faith and reason are enemies. And this is going to take a little bit of work. I'm going to summarize my entire philosophy class. So we put all those lectures. I have a philosophy class that I teach, a semester-long class. I'm going to try to summarize that here in 10 or 15 minutes, just so you can see where this idea of faith and reason being enemies came from and how we can push back against that idea. So the history of our culture, or the history of Western thinking, is often broken down into three eras. You've heard these terms before. The pre-modern era, the modern era, and the postmodern era. Now, I love this picture. This is a picture that I found on the internet, and it kind of makes fun of each era, right? It kind of summarizes, but also pokes fun in each era, which is fine. I love self-deprecating humor. But it's true, and everybody recognizes it and uses these terms, that there are these three eras where people thought radically different. Now, the key between these three eras, what makes them distinct, is how people viewed truth. In the pre-modern era, people mostly, for the most part, even if they weren't Christians, they thought of truth as coming from up there. Most of them were Christians in the pre-modern era, but even think of like Plato, for instance. He thought of truth as transcendent, coming from out there somewhere. But definitely Christians, which were the majority of the thinkers, right, in the pre-modern era. Philosophers, what I mean by that, is that they thought of truth coming from up there, coming from God. In the modern era, things shifted, and most people began to think of truth as what was found out there. Science, nature, that's where truth comes from. Truth is found out there. We discover it via reason and science. But now we've shifted yet again into a new era, what people call a postmodern era, where the majority of people believe, not everybody, but the majority believe that truth, at least the important truth, ultimate truth, meaning purpose, morality, stuff like that, is found in here. It comes from the inside. It's found in our desires, our feelings, our choices, our will. And that's what we're taught today in our culture. That's what Disney movies teach us. That's what Star Wars teaches us. That's what our songs and our books teach us, right? Is that truth is found on the inside, right? Obi-Wan Kenobi taught Luke to trust his feelings, not his sight, not empirical observation. That would be the modern era. No, trust your feelings, Luke. Disney movies tell us to follow our heart. This might seem a little abstract, but let me just boil it down real simple with the issue of gender, right? And I'm not going to take a position on this issue tonight. I'm not going to defend a position on this issue tonight. I just want to show you how thinkers from these three eras would view, because they view truth differently, would view gender differently. So a pre-modern thinker, truth comes from up there, most of them being Christian, would think, you know, truth comes from God. He created us male and female. So if I want to know what male and female should be like, I should look to Him for that. And then He created me, a particular human, a particular male, and so I should look to truth from Him that He revealed to me about what I as a male should be like. And that's how a pre-modern thinker thinks of truth. And there's pre-modern thinkers today. I'm a pre-modern thinker, so we haven't all disappeared, but the majority of people aren't pre-modern thinkers anymore. In the modern era, modern thinkers would think, okay, truth is found out there. So when it comes to gender, people would say, look, we were created by nature, evolution, and our particular species evolved down a path where there's two genders. Not all species did, many of them did, we did. So we are a male and female because that's how evolution produced us. And if we want to know about our particular gender, we would look at our anatomy, our chromosomes, if you will. And we would look at our genitalia and our body, because truth is out there. Truth is objective, it's out there. We would study it via science, if you will. But for a postmodern thinker, important truth is found on the inside. So for a postmodern person, it makes perfect sense to think about, okay, gender is how I feel on the inside. Truth doesn't come from up there. Truth is not out there. Truth is in here. And so gender is determined by how I feel on the inside. That's how a postmodern person would think. And we have to ask, is that correct? How did we come to this point in our culture where we think that way? And is that the correct way to think? Well, how does this relate to faith and reason? Aren't we talking about faith and reason tonight? Well, as I said, we're in a strange place where faith and reason are enemies, but it hasn't always been this way. In fact, pre-modern thinkers said that faith and reason work together. So how have we come to the point now where faith and reason are enemies? And for that, we need to go back to look at the transition from the pre-modern to the modern era. Now, how did that happen? Well, at the beginning of the modern era, we had a lot of success with our human reason, in particular, a direct application of human reason, and that is science, empirical observation, induction. We had a lot of success with science, and we became very optimistic about human reason because of that success. In fact, we probably elevated human reason more than we should have. We got a little bit of hubris. We thought we could figure everything out with human reason because of the success we experienced in science. Case in point, take a look at this quote from Voltaire during the Enlightenment, the 1700s. Voltaire said, "What is faith? Is it to believe that which is evident? No, it's perfectly evident in my mind that there exists a necessary, eternal, supreme, intelligent being. This is no matter of faith, but of reason." So in the modern era, what we did is we elevated reason too highly and therefore pushed down faith. We separated faith and reason, elevated reason, and looked down upon faith. So reason became king, reason became supreme, and faith was looked down upon. And I call this prideful reason. Now, I agree with some of the Enlightenment thinkers, right, that we can make a good case for the existence of God. In fact, we did that tonight. But you'll see there's a difference. I would not reject faith because, unlike a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers, I don't think it's something we can prove with absolute certainty. And that becomes the key in this discussion, absolute certainty. The folks here in this era of prideful reason thought that we could achieve absolute certainty in our human knowledge through reason, and therefore we didn't need any faith. And that's where I think they made a huge mistake. Now, modernism ran into all sorts of problems. And in my philosophy class, we go through a lot of these issues that modernism just crashed and burned. Modernism ran into all sorts of dead ends. And it was out of the problems of modernism that the problems that this search for absolute certainty got us into. It's out of those problems from which postmodernism was born. And I want to talk with you just about one of these dead ends that modernism ran into. It ran into a lot of problems, but I'll just show you one example, and that is love. So within modernism, one of the things that happened within modernism is that what developed was a mechanical view of the world, a mechanical view of the universe, that the universe, the world, is a grand machine that operates based on deterministic cause and effect. And in fact, we are just stuck in this machine as human beings. We're just part of this machine. We're machines ourselves. We're cogs in the machine, if you will. In fact, I'll give you a quote which drives this home. This is from a French thinker, a Nobel Prize winner, one of the founders of molecular biology, Jacques Monod, but he sums up this modern conclusion fairly well. Take a look. He wrote, "Anything can be reduced to simple, obvious mechanical interactions. The cell is a machine, the animal is a machine, man, human beings are machines. The universe isn't pregnant with life or the biosphere with man. We at last now know that we're alone in the unfeeling immensity of the universe, out of which we have emerged only by chance. Our destiny is nowhere spelled out, nor is our duty." So you think about it, with modernism, if all we are robots that were produced haphazardly through this evolutionary process, there's really no good reason to believe that love is real. In fact, according to modernism, love is just a chemical reaction, an accident that evolution picked up on, that nature selected for because it led to greater chances of survival and reproduction. Think about it. If there were a species similar to ours, but that didn't have a desire for sex, didn't have a desire for romance, and a desire to have children, well, that species would die out pretty quick. But no, the chemical reaction that accidentally took place in our evolutionary path, nature selected for, this chemical reaction that causes us to want to have sex, was selected for because it led to greater chances of survival and reproduction. And so love, what we call romantic love, is just an accident. It's not real. You fall in love and want to have sex, want to have children, because that's what evolution programmed you to do. It was just an accident that nature selected for, a mutation, if you will. Because a species that wouldn't pass on their genes wouldn't survive very long. Now, this is just one of the many ways that modernism crashed and burned. Modernism ran into all sorts of dead ends and failures, and it was out of those failures that postmodernism was born. Now, one of the best ways to understand postmodernism is that postmodernism is simply a series of movements, philosophical movements, during the 1800s and 1900s that were reacting against modernism's extreme emphasis on reason. And there's a sense in which I can sympathize with the postmodern critique of modernism. I do think modernism made some huge mistakes. We put too much emphasis on human reason. But I would disagree with the solutions that postmodernism proposed. The first postmodern movement took place in the early 1800s, and it's a movement that you're very well aware of. It's a movement called Romanticism. The Romantics are very well known for their art and their literature. But think about it for a moment, and we'll walk through this movement for just a few minutes. But the Romantic movement, they challenged modernism. They challenged the idea that reason and science were the ultimate form of knowledge. They challenged the mechanical view of the world that I described, that the world could best be understood through the deterministic laws of nature. Instead, they emphasized the inner life, the life of our feelings, our emotions, our desires, our choices, our will. And the poets of this movement are some of the most celebrated poets and writers of all time because they were emphasizing these very human experiences. They celebrated love as real, as opposed to the modern conclusion that love is just an accident, it's not real, it's just a chemical reaction. They said, no, love was real. We don't really understand it. It's irrational. There's no explanation. It's this unreasonable force. We just fall in love. We can't explain it or understand it, but we believe it's real, according to this first postmodern movement, Romanticism. Love isn't known via reason. We have to take a blind leap of faith to believe in love. But we still believe it's real, even though we can't explain it. And this is, you start seeing now in this postmodern movement, and this first postmodern movement, believing in something not based on reason and evidence, but just because we feel it very deeply. As I said, Romanticism was really well known for its literature, the books. Jane Austen, that we love watching Jane Austen movies because they're all about romance and feelings and desires. Frankenstein, part of the dark romanticism that I prefer, Edgar Allan Poe. But think about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein for just a moment, right? What is she writing about, right? Are we just a combination of our physical parts? Could we take, different physical parts from different people and put them together and have life? Or are we more than our physical parts? Is there something more to us than just our physical bodies? So that's what this first postmodern movement was wrestling with, struggling with, pushing back against. And as I said, I appreciate, that they're pushing back and correcting the modern view, but like with most movements, the pendulum swung too far. And it was in this first postmodern movement that a lot of bad ideas were picked up and developed in the rest of the postmodern movements in the 1800s and the 1900s. The idea of believing in yourself, being true to yourself, following your heart, that somehow desires are our insides, our feelings, our desires, our choices are the source of truth. Subjective, relative truth was born out of this way of thinking because, again, they just swung the pendulum too far. What was promoted here, starting in this first postmodern movement, was the idea that we should follow our heart, like I said. And, one of them, for example, Lord Byron did surely follow his heart into many, many love affairs with men and women, including his own sister. And so the idea of following your heart, you see roots here even of the homosexual and the transgender movements. The truth is found on the inside. Now, I'm getting a little bit off topic here. It's just such a fascinating story to see how our culture shifted in its thinking from pre-modernism to modernism and then postmodernism. But we want to focus here on how this affected people's view of faith and reason. Because in the modern era, some people were trying to disprove Christianity using reason and science. Some people were trying to disprove Christianity using reason and science, and this caused some Christians to retreat away from reason and science. They thought that they could protect their faith, their Christian faith, by separating it from reason. So these thinkers, they kept faith and reason as enemies, like the modern thinkers did, but instead of elevating reason and looking down on faith, they did the opposite. They elevated faith and looked down on reason. But by doing that, they radically redefined what faith even is. In a sense, they put faith on an upper shelf where it couldn't be reached. So think about this for a moment. When we have little kids around, maybe we'll put porcelain or something that's fragile up on an upper shelf so children couldn't reach it and break it. And in this sense, these thinkers, starting in the 1800s, put their Christian faith on an upper shelf to protect it from reason and evidence. You can't disprove my faith with your reason and evidence because it's internal, it's in here. You can't reach it with your reason and evidence. And this might, protect your faith from being disproven, but it also kind of cuts the legs out from underneath your faith in that you can't appeal to any sort of reasons and evidence for your beliefs. And this, even within the church, is how faith became more subjective, that it was based more on feelings and desires and emotions. So let me say something here real carefully. If we as Christians take this strategy with our faith, in other words, we believe it because Jesus is in my heart, or we believe it because that's how I feel on the inside, then that's really not much different than a postmodern thinker saying that they are the gender that they are because that's how they feel on the inside. We don't want to take a postmodern strategy in defending our faith. We believe it just because it's how we feel on the inside. We want to be clear that we're claiming Christianity is objectively true, not just a subjective preference on the inside. But this is exactly what happened with a lot of Christian denominations. A lot of Christians in the 1800s took this strategy, unfortunately, instead. Case in point, Soren Kierkegaard was one of these big Christian thinkers. He wrote that to have faith is to lose your mind and to win God. The fact that Christianity is contrary to reason is the necessary precondition for true faith. What I really lack is to be clear in my mind what I am to do, not what I am to know. The thing is to find a truth that is true for me. Here you see this relative subjective truth. To find the ideas for which I can live and die. So postmodernism, just like modernism, kept faith and reason as enemies, but they flip-flopped it. Modernism elevated reason, looked down on faith. Postmodernism elevates faith, but makes it this weird subjective internal thing and looks down on reason. They redefine faith as this irrational subjective choice, this leap of faith, if you will, what I call a blind faith. So we've got these two movements here that view reason and enemy as opposites. Now sometimes people say, well, how could faith ever be a bad thing? Right? How could elevating faith ever be a bad thing? Well, when you separate faith from reason, faith becomes something completely different. See, in the pre-modern era, people thought of faith as trusting something based on good reasons and evidence. The postmodern view of faith is that it's an irrational leap of faith, a blind leap. You don't base your faith on reason and evidence, it's more of an internal subjective thing. And that's what happens when you separate faith from reason. It becomes this internal subjective choice. And it makes Christianity then this mystical leap of faith. Oftentimes this position or this view of Christianity is promoted as somehow more spiritual. even more biblical sometimes. Now, of course, we don't want to elevate reason too much, but we also don't want to look down on reason too much. We need to have an appropriate middle ground position, an understanding, a correct understanding on human reason. Not prideful reason. We don't want to make too much out of our reason, but we don't want to completely reject the importance of our, as I see it, God-given reason. There are two extremes that we should avoid. So I'm a proponent of going back to more of the pre-modern position. The pre-modern position which saw faith and reason working together. So let me go back now in time and explain that position. And this is what I'm proposing, at least in this class, how we should understand things. Faith and reason work together, not enemies. They work together. So I think the best way to explain the pre-modern position is to compare and contrast it with the postmodern position. All right, so this is going to be kind of small font. I apologize for that, but bear with me as I try to explain. So in postmodernism, right, the postmodern way of thinking is that there's two types of beliefs, and they work completely different, okay? First of all, there's reason-based, science-based beliefs, facts, if you will, and you can achieve 100% absolute certainty in these type of facts. Not about how things really are, but about how they appear to you. And that's, based on Immanuel Kant and his work in epistemology. But still this idea that you can achieve as a human being 100% absolute certainty with these type of beliefs. A postmodern thinker then would view faith or religious beliefs quite differently. That reason is not helpful here at all and shouldn't be used. And so there's a sense in which 0% certainty can be achieved in this realm of religious things. God, morality. We just take an irrational leap of faith to believe these things, and this based more on subjective aspects like feelings, emotions, passions, desires, or pragmatism, what works for you. Now, according to postmodernism, sometimes I call this Kantian postmodernism, these two types of beliefs are completely separate. They work differently and they don't ever touch one another. There's completely different realms of thinking or knowledge, so to speak. Reason needs no faith because you can achieve 100% absolute certainty. Down here, reason is not helpful at all. And so down here, these are just subjective leaps of faith. And this way of thinking, this actually might make sense to you. This might actually be how you think of things, but it's because you were raised in the postmodern culture that we're in. So I'm going to propose, in contrast to that, a pre-modern way of thinking, a pre-modern position on faith and reason. And that is simply that all of our beliefs work the same way, no matter what they're about. So our scientific beliefs, our religious beliefs, when we believe in a spouse, when we trust a spouse, when we choose to marry somebody, all beliefs work the same way. First of all, according to a pre-modern position, we can't achieve 100% certainty in any belief simply because we're finite creatures. All of our beliefs are based on reason and evidence, but that can never get us to 100% absolute certainty because we're not omniscient. We based our beliefs as finite creatures on the evidence and reasons that we have encountered to this point. Now, some people will push back on this and claim that they can be absolute certain, but I just don't think it's possible, right? I mean, can you be absolutely certain that your brakes work? You say, well, I'll get a mechanic to take a look at it. Well, can you be absolutely certain that your mechanic is correct? And you can say, well, I'll study and become a mechanic myself then. But still, right, maybe your training wasn't exactly perfect. there's always going to be room for doubt at some level. Now, you can, achieve 99.9% certainty, but getting to 100% absolute certainty, my position, at least, is that is impossible because we're finite creatures. Now, this is a hugely important point. Whatever certainty you can achieve through reason and evidence, let's say it's 80% about some belief that your brakes work, the remaining percentage, in that case 20%, is not faith. Okay, I think this is buying into the idea that faith and reason are enemies, are opposites. And we don't want to do that. So, use the mechanic as the example, right? If you're 80%, or your brakes, if you're 80% certain that your brakes will work based on reason and evidence, the remaining 20% isn't faith. That'd be thinking of faith and reason as opposites. If that were the case, then the more reasons and evidence you had to believe that your brakes work, then the less faith you would have in them. It might be easier to think about it in terms of a spouse, right? If you're married or if you want to be married someday, you would trust your spouse. And let's say, you've been married for a while and you trust your spouse is faithful, you trust your spouse loves you, and let's say based on your experience and your time with them that you're 80% confident in your spouse based on those reasons and evidence. The remaining 20% isn't faith, right? Because let's say you continue to be married for a few more years and that, based on reason and evidence, your certainty in them moves up to 90%. Well, if you were thinking of faith being the difference between 100 and where you're at, then in that case, if you moved up from 80 to 90, you would be saying that your faith in them has decreased. It went from 20 to 10%. But no, your faith is actually increased based on these additional reasons and evidence you have for them. So the point I'm driving at here is that the opposite of certainty is not faith. The opposite of certainty is uncertainty. That's how we want to view the opposite percentage or the remaining percentage. And so this is one of the reasons why I disagree with the title of the Frank Turek and Norman Geisler book that you're reading. Great book, I love the book, and I know both of the authors, but the title of the book perpetuates this idea that faith and reason are opposites. So think about the title for a second. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. What it's inferring or what it's implying is that there's more evidence for Christianity than atheism. It's implying then that atheism requires more faith. It's saying the less evidence you have, the more faith you need. But again, it's making that mistake of assuming that uncertainty is what faith is. It makes faith and reason opposites. Whereas I'm trying to make the case that when you have more reason and evidence to believe in something, that actually increases your faith in it. You have more reasons to trust it. And that's what faith is trusting something based on good reasons and evidence. So, what is faith then? How would we want to define faith in a premodern position? Well, I think the term faith can be used in two ways, right? The term faith can be used to describe two different things. First of all, it can be used to talk about the confidence you have in a particular belief, right? And this can range from low to high, right? But it's positively related to the certainty you have based on reason and evidence. So the more reason and evidence you have, the greater your certainty percentage. Thus, the greater your faith in this sense, the greater your confidence. So if you're 90% certain based on reason and evidence, then you have a very high confidence or very high faith that something is true. Now, faith can also be used in the sense of a decision. And this is binary. This is either yes or no. So sometimes the word faith is used to talk about a decision whether you're going to trust somebody or not, or trust something, your brakes, your spouse. Either you decide to trust or not. And this can be done no matter what percentage you're at in terms of reason and evidence, or what percentage you're at in terms of certainty. I mean, you could be, for some silly reason, you could be only 10% certain that your brakes work and still decide to drive your car anyway, still decide to trust it. It might be silly to do that. But again, this is a binary choice. Either you trust or you don't. Think of that game where you fall back. You fall backwards and you trust your friends to catch you or not. Well, either you trust them and you fall back, or you don't. Now, you might have a lot of good reasons and evidence to trust them because they've caught you before, they've told you, you have good friends. Or maybe you don't have very good reasons to trust them. Maybe, they've been mean to you in the past and they've dropped you before, but you still could make that decision to choose to trust them. So in that sense, faith can be used as a binary yes or no decision. I think one of the best examples of this is marriage. I use this example all the time. I got it from Francis Schaeffer, because it's exactly what we go through when we trust somebody as our spouse. And this also, I think, drives home the idea that thinking of faith this way doesn't have to be robotic or calculated. I mean, when we trust somebody to marry them, it's a very personal, involved decision. It's not done robotically. It's not done with a cold, logical calculation. But you're choosing, that's what marriage is you're choosing to trust somebody. And we do this, based on reasons and evidence. We date someone, we get to know them, we see how they act, how they treat us, how they treat others. And so we enter that relationship with a decision to trust. Based on reasons and evidence we accumulate as we get to know them. It's personal, yet it's still based on reasons and evidence. It's not a blind faith. This is where we need to avoid the two extremes, right? A blind faith would just be saying, okay, I'm going to marry that person, and I'm going to trust them with no reasons and evidence, just a complete stranger, right? An arranged marriage doesn't even do that. In an arranged marriage, you're trusting your parents to choose somebody to be your spouse. But at the same time, to avoid the other extreme, we can never be absolute certain in our trust of someone as our spouse. When we get to that wedding day, there's no way as a finite creature we're going to be 100% absolute certain that they're going to be faithful, love us forever, so on and so forth. So it's a decision of trust, decision of faith. But it's a decision based on good reasons and evidence. And that's what Christianity is asking of us. That's what the Bible, the New Testament, Jesus is asking of us. To trust Him, but not this blind leap of faith. He gives us good reasons and evidence to trust Him. It's not possible to prove Christianity is true with absolute certainty. So it's still a decision, a binary decision to trust or not trust. But it's not a blind decision. We can't know with absolute certainty, but it's also something we don't choose blindly, but we trust based on good reasons and evidence, at least according to the New Testament. This is a verse, and we'll see it again when I make my case that apologetics is biblical here at the end of the semester. But one of the verses I'll refer to is this one, Acts 1:3, a verse from which I named my own ministry after, Convincing Proof. But my point here in sharing this is just to say that the New Testament is, yes, asking us to trust in Jesus, but not blindly, based on good reasons and evidence. For it says, to these, his disciples, he presented himself alive after his suffering on the cross by many convincing proofs, appearing to them over a period of 40 days and speaking of the things concerning the kingdom of God. So yes, it's a matter of faith, but my point is that all of our decisions in life work this way. As finite creatures, we can't achieve absolute certainty, so all of our decisions, who to marry, what mechanic to trust, are based on good reasons and evidence, but all involve an element of faith, because we can't know with absolute certainty. It's key to understand the opposite of certainty is not faith, though. The opposite of certainty is uncertainty. But because of that uncertainty, it entails some trust, some faith on our part. So when the New Testament asks us to trust in Christ, it's not asking us to do anything differently than all the decisions of trust we have to make in life. The uniqueness is what is being asked of us to trust in Jesus for. And according to Christianity, we trust in Christ to rescue us from our evil choices. In fact, to reconcile us back to God, because we deserve God's judgment for our evil choices. But Jesus, according to the New Testament, promised that we could be forgiven, reconciled back to God, and welcomed into an eternal relationship with Him, God the Father, in heaven for all eternity, if we trust not in what we can do to get to heaven, but in what Jesus did for us on the cross. That's what's being asked of us through Christianity, and so we need to make that clear as we communicate this as apologists.